Let's talk about how you can take ownership of the dot on a Python class. What I've got on the screen right now is I have this holding class that we've been working with, and I want to address a very specific problem. Let's go ahead and make a holding object to start. We're going to make an object, give it some data here. On this object, we have these different attributes like shares and price and name and so forth. And so here's a problem. How would I prevent somebody from setting one of these attributes to a bad value? Like what if somebody came in here and they said h.price is equal to a lot? Turns out that Python is perfectly happy with that because it's dynamically typed. I mean, attributes can be any object whatsoever. There's no enforcement of any kind of typing on there. Actually, a more realistic example, it's not likely that somebody would set the price to a lot. More realistic example is somebody might set the price to quote 38.4. This is the kind of thing that could happen if somebody didn't properly convert an input, maybe on a user interface or something like that. Like you didn't properly convert from a string and you now set this to a string. What could that do to the code? Well, there's actually a lot of interesting things that can happen with that. One of the things that will happen is the object might actually work for a while. For instance, if I were to do the cost method, you'll actually find that the code runs, but it produces complete nonsense. Well, what's going on is I'm making 100 copies of the string 38.4. That could be a very interesting thing to kind of debug. One of the things that you might think about as a programmer is, can I prevent that? Could I lock this code down and make it so that people cannot do that? Well, it turns out that you can lock the class down if you're willing to take a few additional steps. One of the things that you might do to address that problem is go into the class and try to control the price through maybe a get and a set function. This is a fairly standard technique that you will see in other programming languages. The idea is that I'm going to write a pair of getters and setters that in some sense manage access to that attribute. So maybe I have get price and I have set price. And then in the set price, I would do some kind of validation. I would say if this is not a float, then you're going to get a type error. You might take some approach like this. Now, there's some parts that I have not implemented yet. I'll get to that in a second. But what you're doing here is you're going to try to carefully regulate access to the price through a pair of get and set function. One thing that I might want to do is also hide the price in doing that with either an underscore variable or some other means. Actually, maybe I won't do that to start, just to illustrate a problem. So let's go ahead and just make it price. Let's say you make that change. Okay, so we make a change. We're going to go make a holding object. Same way as before here. The idea is that if you want to get the price, you would do get price. And if you want to set the price, you would do set price. And the whole idea is that if you did set price with a bad value, it would blow up. We're putting that attribute kind of under management there. Here's the problem that arises. How do you force people to use those? Originally, the code had like this price attribute. Like you could say h.price. How do I force people to use the set price function? Turns out that I can just completely bypass it by setting h.price. Okay, so that's a little bit annoying. So you get this problem of how do you force people to use the get and the set? One of the ways that you might do that is hide the code or hide the price in a private attribute. Maybe underscore is what holds the price. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of remove that from consideration here. Like maybe in the init, I would use underscore price to hide that. The problem with doing that is that it's actually going to break almost all of my existing code. So if I change the name of an attribute, I'm going to have to go through this class and change a lot of stuff. Like everywhere that I used price, I would now have to do underscore price in the different output methods, cost method. A lot of stuff is going to break using price. I would have to go through here and fix a lot of things. It's even sort of worse than that if I had other code that I was working with. For example, we did this whole little table printing thing where you could create like a formatter. This is from an earlier lesson. And then we had these things that you could do where you could print a table and then select different attributes like that. All of that code is going to break because price disappeared. It's like you ripped out the attribute and it's gone. That's kind of unfortunate. It's sort of even worse than that. Let's say you did have a holding. Okay, so you had one of these holding objects kind of sitting around the same as before. If somebody didn't change their code properly, like let's say you had a statement like h.price is equal to 45.23, Python lets that run but it actually has no impact on anything because what happened is the actual attribute is underscore price. All you did with this assignment here is that you just added a new element to the dictionary. So now you have price and you have underscore price. And heads are completely exploding and you're trying to figure out why the code is not working correctly. So this idea of using getters and setters, we're on the right track with that, but it has a lot of undesirable side effects in the sense that I have to change all my code. It breaks other people's code, and then you can end up with sort of weird corner cases, especially if you're retroactively putting this on an object. It turns out that there's a better way of doing this, which is to define something known as a property attribute. So what I'm going to do is declare a get and a set function as a property. The syntax for this is a little jarring, I will admit that, but essentially we're keeping the get and set function. I didn't actually change any part of the code inside, I'm just changing the declaration of it. So I'm declaring price as a property. And if I do that, it turns out that I can go back to my other code and change everything back to .price. I'm going to make it so it's back in the original form here. All I've done is I've introduced price as a property. And if you do that, this amazingly awesome thing happens. What happens is you have essentially taken ownership of the dot for that one attribute. So what happens is your object will have a price, and it will have shares, and it will look exactly the same way that it did before. You can set the price, and everything works great, except that if you set a bad value, you will intercept that, and you can generate an error. So this is a really powerful tool because you can essentially focus in on like a specific attribute, take ownership of that attribute, and then do things like type checking, validation, other kinds of processing steps behind the scene. I want to emphasize that this is not just about type checking. I mean, you could put other kinds of checks in here, like if the price is less than 0, for instance, you could raise a, value error saying that negative price, that doesn't make any sense. You could have different kinds of checks taking place. Very powerful thing. One other thing to note, you do not have to change any existing code. I don't have to change it up in the init function or anything like that. In fact, I do not want to change that line that I've highlighted. The reason for that is that it will catch usage errors if somebody tries to create an object with bad data. Like let's say somebody tried to create a holding and they just pass in a bunch of strings. You would actually see it crash when it tried to set the price because it's not a float. This is intercepting the dot and allowing you to do special processing on that. One other use of properties that I will also mention is that you can use it to kind of smooth out usage problems. One of the things that we noted at some point earlier is that you have these attributes like name and shares and price, but cost is a method that you have to put parentheses on and almost guarantee that people are going to forget to put the parentheses on that cost because it's like an outlier. It's like different from the other attributes. One of the things that you could do is you could declare that as a property as well. What will happen is that will now become, a computed attribute. It will look like it's a normal attribute, like you can say h.cost. And whoever's using that will have no idea that that's actually being computed underneath the covers. Like if somebody sells the shares, that cost like magically updates at the same time. Again, it's defined as a property. The only clue that that might be different is it turns out that if somebody tried to change the value or change the cost, it would get rejected, partly because I didn't define a setter for that. This is a very powerful thing that you can do in a class, essentially take attributes, hide them behind properties, and it actually gives you a way of locking down the internals of an object. You might actually take this idea and extend it to some of the other attributes. Maybe locking down the shares, for instance, to require that to be an integer. We'll do this one real quick. Do a little more type checking on it. Expected an int, and so forth. You'll see that once we start using this new class, all of a sudden it's behaving, maybe more sane way than it did before, especially in terms of just locking it down. So if you access shares, it works. If you try to set shares to a bad value, it blows up. Same thing with the price. So this is one of the tools for locking down the dot. We're going to look at another technique in the next part that addresses the problem of the amount of code that we're having to write here. So we'll look at that in the next section.